Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for coming. My name is Bernard. I'm a bookseller here at Politics and Prose. On behalf of the owners and of the staff, I'd like to welcome all of you to this evening's event. As you may already know, Politics and Prose hosts hundreds of in person events along with our partnered and supported events, trips, and classes. So please check our website for a full list. A little bit of housekeeping before we start. Uh, First of all, please turn off or silence your cell phones so as not to disturb the event. For the Q&A, please remember to step up to the microphone over here by the pillar before asking your questions so we can not only hear and enjoy the conversation but to also ensure that it is recorded. For those of you who want to buy copies of the book, we are selling them right out front by the cash registers. We will be doing a signing after the Q&A, so if you'd like to get your book signed, again, please line up by the pillar over here. And we will come by to ask for your name if you want personalization. So please have your books ready for us. And lastly, once the event is complete, we ask that you fold up your chairs, lean them against something sturdy to help us out a bit. I am honored to introduce Professor Laura Beers to all of you. She is a professor of British history at American University and is also the author of Your Britain and Red Ellen. She is particularly interested in the ways in which politics both influences and is shaped by cultural and social life, and in the role of the mass media in modern society. Her writing has appeared in the New Republic and Washington Post, among other publications, and on CNN.com. Tonight, she will be talking about her new book, Orwell's Ghost: Wisdom and Warnings for the 21st Century. In this timely work of nonfiction that is part literary criticism, part sociopolitical treatise, Professor Beers considers Orwell's huge body of work and how it is being co opted by various political ideologies. She demystifies Orwell and examines what Orwell really meant in his writing and how we can use them to make sense of our fractured world. Kirkus Reviews writes that Orwell's Ghosts is a critical assessment of the contribution that George Orwell's writing can make to contemporary social, economic, and political problems. Tonight, Professor Beers will be in conversation with David Smith, who is the Washington bureau chief of The Guardian. Everyone, let us all welcome Professor Laura Beers and David Smith.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for coming. And many congratulations on this wonderful book. And I'm delighted to see it not only as a Brit, but someone who works for the Observer newspaper in the UK, along with The Guardian. And George Orwell is a famous alumnus of the Observer and still spoken of with pride there. Well, I wonder, first of all, could you tell us a bit about yourself, and in particular, you have a lot of connections with the UK. And as part of that, where did you first discover George Orwell's writing?
Well, I actually discovered George Orwell's writing not in the UK, but in the US, and I'll come back to that. I am, as said in my introduction, I've written a couple of other books, actually all of which have quoted Orwell. Almost everything I've ever written makes some reference to Orwell because he's so applicable in almost every context. So I'm a British historian by training. My first book was on the media and the early history of the Labour Party. And Orwell, and we'll probably get into this more, but saw himself, he was aligned with the political left. He supported the post-1945 Labour government. And he wrote for many of the publications that I discuss in that first book, Your Britain, Media and the Making of the Labour Party, including The Observer, as David noted. And I later then wrote a biography of a kind of radical female activist and trained unionist. Actually, very sweetly, one of the research assistants for that book is here with us this evening. But he again sort of circulated in that same world as Ellen at the time. So he was someone who I've sort of known both, having read, I first read Animal Farm in middle school in Montgomery County in the fall of 1989, just as the Berlin Wall had come down and then those dying days of the Soviet Union. And I read him very much in a context of the allegory for communist Russia. And I went on in high school to read 1984. So I had very much an American's introduction to George Orwell and the kind of introduction that really frames him as a Cold Warrior. But then I was a European historian. I still am a European historian. That is what I do for a living. But I mean, in college, I studied European history, and there I encountered Orwell in more depth. I read Homage to Catalonia, where he writes about volunteering to fight for the Spanish Republic against Franco's forces in the Spanish Civil War. And actually, in graduate school, in a course on political economy, I read The Road to Wigan Pier, where he talks about the impact of unemployment and of economic inequality on communities in the northwest of England in the 1930s. And he really writes very poignantly, and I discuss that work in the book in some detail, about the way that economic and social inequality are really corrosive for social solidarity and for society more broadly through this work of social investigation. And I remember saying to my professor, as a grad, this is a course in political economy, and he was a political economist by training. I said, why are we reading this book by Orwell? He's a journalist. And he said, Laura, this is one of the most important things you could ever read to understand how economies actually impact individuals. And I ultimately very much agree with him. So my Orwell, my formal Orwell, has come to me in different ways, in different phases throughout my education, but I've also then embraced him on my own, and his essays and his novels are kind of gift that keeps on giving. He's such a wonderful writer, and so a lot of the Orwell that I discuss in this book is Orwell I came to on my own, as opposed to through a formal context.
And what was the inspiration for this book? Why now?
Well, the inspiration for this book and why now? I mean, I think in some ways, why now? This book, in an immediate sense, grew out of January 6, 2021, and the aftermath of January 6th, and this moment in the immediate aftermath. And I talk about this in the book, where you have quite prominently Josh Hawley and Donald Trump Jr. calling their deplatforming. Josh Hawley by Simon & Schuster, with whom he'd had a book contract, which was canceled when he did his raised fist in solidarity with the insurrection on January 6th, and then Donald Trump Jr. about his father's removal from Twitter, as it then was, saying that this deplatforming was Orwellian censorship, and this was kind of totalitarianism and thought policing. And it started a conversation, I think, within the broader public about the way that the right in the U.S. was using Orwell's ideas, and what, whether Orwell really was an advocate for free speech, but also whether deplatforming from a kind of private company like Twitter, or cancellation of your book contract, was really what Orwell had in mind when he was talking about censorship. So that was the immediate cause. But in a kind of longer durée, I teach a course on Orwell. And I teach it, it's a history course. And I've taught it both in the UK at the University of Birmingham and for several years at American University just down the street. And the course really focuses on the early 20th century, the period in which Orwell is writing. He's born in 1903. He dies in January 1950 at age 46. Horrifying thought when I'm sitting here at age 45, but life cut way too short. But he's active in the 30s and 40s. And so it's a course that's really about the first half of the 20th century. And students read 7 book-length works by Orwell and many of his essays. And they use it as a lens to look at the history of Europe in the first half of the 20th century. But students, AU students in particular, who are they're very tuned into current events. They started making all these connections between Orwell's writing on the early 20th century and our current political moment. And it was really, some of those conversations and seminars that got me thinking about the continued relevance of a lot of what he has to say to the politics of today. So, I mean, in effect, I owe the debt behind this book to my students.
And maybe it's the mark of a great writer that you often find that both the left and the right tend to claim them, whether it's Shakespeare in a play like Coriolanus or many other examples. And these writers, they draw like iron filings, whatever the moment dictates. I mean, in terms of Orwell's contemporary resonance, before we get on to January 6th, I wonder, first of all, if I could ask you about what actually the left was saying initially, just thinking back particularly, for example, to the start of Donald Trump's presidency in 2017. That infamous day, I was in that White House press briefing room when Sean Spicer claimed that Trump had the biggest inauguration crowd ever. A few days later, Kellyanne Conway was on the air talking about alternative facts. A lot of commentators at that point used words like Orwellian and doublespeak and so on. Did you observe that pattern at the time?
I did at the time, and I talk about it in the book, right? But this critique of both Trump and also Boris Johnson's administration, and I think I quote Raphael Baer, I think it's either The Guardian or The Observer, referring to Johnson, who was the architect of Brexit. And actually, when I did teach the course at the University of Birmingham in 2018, several of my students pointed to this, the pink bus that was used in that campaign to argue that Brexit would bring funding to the NHS as an example of kind of an Orwellian doublethink that where people were holding in their minds two obviously mutually contradictory statements. Brexit will make us a wealthier country, and somehow believing them. But the left was very critical of these right-wing populist politicians in recent years, has been, and the way that they have used kind of the manipulation of language and this idea of kind of holding to mutually contradictory truths simultaneously, and also the distortion of fact. And I talk a lot about Orwell's Politics of Truth in the book. Not just his defense of free speech, but his defense of true speech. And Kellyanne Conway's, their facts and their alternative facts would have been anathema to Orwell's, thinking, which really was about the importance of objective truth and the importance of defending that in writing. So yes, you have this one critique, and the book clearly takes a side on which critique is the more valid, right? And that uses Orwellian to say, okay, this kind of manipulation of language that we see today is Orwellian. And then this right-wing critique that says, okay, well, the thought policing and the woke culture that says you can't say certain things, that this is what's really Orwellian about 21st century culture.
And just to illustrate that, you mentioned already earlier in the aftermath of January the 6th, 2021, Donald Trump Jr. writing a tweet, "We are living Orwell's 1984. Free speech no longer exists in America. It died with big tech. And what's left is there only for a chosen few." And as you mentioned, Josh Hawley was writing similarly, and so many other right-wing commentators. And you've noted, Elon Musk walks around with a T-shirt saying, what would Orwell think? So I suppose I know at some points in this book you caution against I'm not just going to provide a checklist of what would Orwell think about these topics, but you do sort of make some judgments about what Orwell would think of those Elon Musk arguments.
Yes, and I think part of the reason that Musk bought Twitter, right, is he disapproved of what he saw as the silencing and deplatforming of voices, and he wanted it to be a space for that would give access to those voices, including Donald Trump, as we saw in his live streamed interview the other day. The irony, of course, is that the way in which X, as it's now called, operates does silence many other voices and create these type of information vacuums that have people living in the world, the kind of dystopian world of 1984 on some level. But you're right, David, that there's this question of free speech, but also true speech that I do talk about a lot in the book. And I try not to say, because it's really easy to take someone who's been dead 75 years and say, oh, if they were with us now, this is what they'd say, because they can't prove you wrong right there. And so I try to skirt away from that. But I do think that on the question of, whether what freedom means is the right to just spew obvious lies and not be silenced, is really what Orwell was saying. I think there's pretty solid evidence that it was not. And I think if we look at, the most obvious place to look to underscore that argument is 1984. And his famous quote from 1984, that freedom is the right to say that 2 + 2 = 4. And he says this in the context of Winston Smith, who is being tortured by O'Brien, a member of the thought police in the Ministry of Love, ironically called because it's a sort of a place of torture, right? And O'Brien is trying to make him say that 2 + 2 = 5, and he's trying to hang on to this truth, right? And he says before he finally succumbs, that freedom is the right to say that 2 + 2 = 4. And if Orwell really lived in Kellyanne Conway's world of, there are facts and there are alternative facts, then it wouldn't matter if you said 2 + 2 = 17, right? But that is not his definition of freedom. And I think his own career and his journalistic writing for The Observer and other venues throughout his career, as well as his book-length writing, really is a testament to his belief in the importance of the power of facing, as he would say. This is another famous Orwell quote: "The power of facing unpleasant facts," right? And actually kind of calling a spade, and even when it's easier to avoid unpleasant truths, to really identify and own those truths.
And freedom is the right to say Joe Biden won the 2020 election. How do you think Orwell might have reacted to a figure like Donald Trump? Would he have recognized him from European authoritarians, and what would he have made of the constant disinformation?
I do think he would have recognized him, right? I mean, it's easy for every generation to think that we're the first to experience, gosh, it's very hard to hold this microphone and to try to fiddle for a place in the book. I'm going to give it to you, David Rose, because there's a great bit in here. Let's see if I can find it quickly, and if I can't, I'll just give up. But where Orwell's writing about the Second World War and lies that are being printed during World War II. Let's see. I think we've got it. Okay, so this is something he writes in Tribune magazine during the Second World War. And this is in February 1944, when the Nazis had been publishing fictitious accounts of the success of their bombing raids over Britain that had exaggerated those for kind of to boost morale on the home front. And he says, "Now we're aware that these raids did not happen. But what use would our knowledge be if the Germans conquered Britain? For the purposes of a future historian, did those raids happen or didn't they? The answer is, if Hitler survives, they happened, and if he falls, they didn't happen. So with innumerable other events over the past 10 or 20 years. Did Trotsky plot with the Nazis? How many German airplanes were shot down in the Battle of Britain? Does Europe welcome the new order? In no case do you get one answer which is universally accepted because it is true. In each case, you get a number of totally incompatible answers, one of which is finally adopted as the result of a physical struggle. History is written by the winners." And I think, Orwell in his own time could clearly see that he lived in a world of facts and alternative facts. And part of the reason that he was as committed as he was to the struggle against fascism, as I said, he travels to Spain at the end of 1936 to fight on behalf of the Republic against Franco's insurrection. And he sees this as a proxy battle against fascism in the one place where an actual war is being fought, because Franco is being supported by Mussolini's Italy and Nazi Germany. And it's because he believes that it matters. He goes on to say that the one thing that can be said for Britain is that if they win the war, they will tell fewer lies about it than their adversaries at the end of that column. And so he knows that objective truth is very much under threat in his own time, but he believes that it still has value and is worth fighting for.
And some notable points about Orwell, correct me if I'm wrong, he never set foot in America. There is no audio recording of him. There is no video recording of him, only photos. And indeed, he was not really into technology. He didn't own a radio. So I suspect if he was alive today, he would not be waging some online battle. He would not be tweeting.
Probably not. I mean, one of the great ironies, if some of you in the audience might be old enough to remember it, I just barely am. But in 1984, when the Apple IIe personal computer was introduced, right, they unveiled the new world of home computing with this ad that did a spoof on 1984, and it has a woman running down and crashing these what look like kind of zombies who are all in their suits, and they're all male and they're all black and white, and she comes in color, and it says that the home computing will bring to you this new world of liberation from And it's ironic on so many levels. It's ironic because in some ways, home computing and its successors in the iPhone and all the rest of it have brought to us a level of surveillance that is probably closer to the world of Big Brother than anything we had known beforehand. But it's also ironic because, as you say, Orwell himself was a great technophobe. He works for the BBC briefly during the war, but he never himself owned a radio. But it's also ironic because it's featuring a woman as the heroine and the real agent of change. And Orwell was a lot of things that are that I have a lot of respect for, but he was not a feminist. And the women in his writing were never the real agents of change. They were sort of the helpbeats of the men, or if not the sort of saboteurs and reactionaries. So it's a there's a lot that can be said about Orwell's relationship to technology, but he did not embrace it, and I don't think would he'd sort of be appalled probably to think of the way we live now.
And just to pick up on one of your points there, I think you take the view Orwell was not necessarily a misogynist, but he was a chauvinist, and at one point you quote something he wrote where feminists are dismissed in a bucket along with sort of crackpots and others. Could you talk about that?
Yes, this is one of probably in Britain at least Orwell's best known quotations, and it comes from The Road to Wigan Pier, and he's talking about what for him, I mean, this is a problem that we see now, right? This idea that he wants to build a broad left coalition. He's a supporter of socialist revolution, but he argues that the kind of coalition of socialists in Britain are repelling normal people. They need a Tim Walz to kind of make them seem normcore as opposed to weird, or as he says, cranks. And then he starts enumerating the types of cranks who he sees as drawn to the socialist movement. And these include nudist, fruit juice drinkers, sandal wearers. I forget, there's a whole, and then he ends with, and feminist. And so feminists are in his, crank bucket there. And which is unfair both in his, it's just objectively unfair, but it's also, unfair within the kind of normal politics of the time, because this is not the time of suffragists who are, slashing paintings in the National Gallery and setting fire to letterboxes and really kind of seem scary and revolutionary. That really had ended with the First World War. Women had been granted the franchise first partially in 1918 and then on equal terms with men in 1928. And it is equally not the kind of second wave radical feminism of the 1970s, right? You're not talking about kind of earth mothers living in communes, fighting nuclear warfare. Feminists that there were feminists and there were many women who self-identified as such in the 1930s were, for the most part, peacefully and constitutionally lobbying for women's equal pay, access to the civil service. They're fairly, mainstream in making arguments that a lot of sensible people on the left did support. But I think what is crucial is that Orwell is, he's very much of the political left. That's his milieu, that's his self-identification, but he's not feminist, and he doesn't see that tension. It was very possible in the 1930s when he was writing to be of the political left and not to be a feminist, despite the fact that most feminists did identify with the political left. And I think that's something that's changed to a degree, but not entirely, right? It still is the case that most feminists do tend to be political leftist, but not all political leftists are necessarily feminist. And if you think of those discourses around Bernie Bros, 8 years ago or whatever, that tension of how that Venn diagram looks, which is really like an egg and a yolk more than a real symbiosis, I think is something that existed in Orwell's time and that he is evidence of and that is still with us today.
And considering an issue that is obviously front and center in American politics today after the Supreme Court decision on Roe versus Wade and what Democrats are going to be talking about in this election, what do we know about George Orwell's views on abortion rights?
Well, I talk about this in the book. It's one of the the themes that I touch on in the chapter on feminism and the patriarchy. But one of Orwell's novels, his less well-known, but I think one of his better novels, Keep the Aspidistra Flying, really centers around this relationship between a kind of, a bit of a loser and failed writer who's kind of an Orwell character almost, and his girlfriend, and the girlfriend and him, they, I mean, he doesn't love her. She's sort of a girlfriend of convenience. He actually sees her as associated largely with, everything he's trying to rebel against, because he sees himself as this, anti-capitalist martyr. But he still very much wants her to sleep with him. And so eventually she gives in and she does sleep with him. And then she gets pregnant. And the whole crux of the novel, not to give it away, centers around, what she should do and whether she should have an abortion. And Orwell's own kind of politics come through very clearly in this, because he was an opponent of abortion. And I mean, it's another one of these things he depicts as crankish at other points in his writing, right? Having abortion clinics on every corner is something that crankish socialist societies, dream about. But for him, this is he sees himself as, valuing life and therefore rejecting abortion. But as a consequence, he really fails to engage with feminist arguments about abortion politics in Britain at the time. I mean, in the US, the organized abortion rights movement doesn't really emerge until after the Second World War. But in Britain from the 1930s, there is an Abortion Law Reform Association, which is really making coherent arguments that abortion rights are about women's rights and women's bodily autonomy is necessary for women's equality. And it's just not an argument that he engaged with. And I think it is part of his, he's politically a radical, but socially in many ways very conservative. And it's part of this pattern of social conservatism.
And I did hear the argument made that in 1984, just the writing of Winston Smith, his misogyny is so extreme at times where he's even feeling murderous towards women. That potentially indicates a self-awareness on Orwell's part that he's writing himself into Winston Smith there and kind of realizing he needs to be more enlightened. Do you buy that argument?
I don't know. I mean, I say early in the book, and I hold to it, that this is, I'm not attempting to psychoanalyze Orwell, though you really could if you wanted to go down that road, right? I mean, this is a man whose mother and several of his aunts and her friends had been active suffragists back in the day, who was raised in an all-female household because he was a child of empire, and his father was a civil servant for the British Raj in the Indian Civil Service and lived overseas. So he had two sisters, and he and his mother and his sisters lived at home in England. And his father, until his retirement, lived in India. So he's raised in this female household until he goes off to boarding school. He has his mother's politics are broadly feminist. He marries two very well-educated women, both better educated than he is. He goes to Eton, which is the poshest of the prep schools in Britain, but he doesn't go on to university, whereas his first wife has a master's degree in psychology, actually. So she probably had a lot of thoughts about his attitudes towards women. So he's, you would think prima facie that he would not be someone who had these kind of reactionary, kind of patriarchal politics, but he does. And I don't know if any of you guys have read Anna Funder's Wifedom, which was out last summer, and was this kind of partially historical, partially fictional imagining of what it must have been like to be Eileen Blair, his first wife. Orwell's birth name was Eric Blair. George Orwell was a pen name that he wrote under. He never legally changed his name. And so when Eileen married him in 1936, she took the name Eileen Blair. And in Funder's imagining, here she is repressed. She's someone with this master's in psychology. She's brilliant in her own right, and she basically becomes his drudge and kind of helps to further his career ambitions. And she imagines Eileen is quite resentful. I mean, I'm not sure the evidence really holds up that she was, actually. I think she really did admire him and believe that devoting her life to furthering his genius was something that she did willingly. But it raises questions about his gender politics, that he kind of allowed her to totally subsume herself in him and his ambitions and his writing and his career to the extent that he did. And I think speaks to this sense that he had that the natural order was one where men were at the center and women were kind of peripheral helpmeets and not characters in their own right. And you see that very much, in 1984, where Julia is a rebel from the waist down, as Winston dismissively calls her, is someone who falls asleep when he starts trying to talk to her about big ideas of the revolution against Big Brother, who breaks much more easily than he does when ultimately she's interrogated in the Ministry of Love, and who is not really his equal, even though he ultimately too is defeated, right? She's the weaker vessel. And you see it too if you look, I mean, as soon as you start looking, it's everywhere in Orwell's writing. I mean, even if you look in Animal Farm, right, the female animals are the kind of animals who undermine the revolution. Molly runs off to, the capitalist farm because she's offered sugar cubes and ribbons for her hair, the show pony, and ultimately, is a saboteur and double agent before she disappears altogether. And the other female animals are very unintelligent. Molly, the workhorse, can't read and can't really work out her ideas other than a vague sense that something's not right, and so ends up kind of useless in doing anything to save her friend Boxer, who's ultimately, if those of you who read this when you were children, Boxer being turned into glue, sorry, spoiler alert, is one of those traumas that sticks with your average 10, 11-year-old. But yeah, it's a kind of recurrent, just the way that women are sidelined or sort of shown as lesser or shown as reactionary. And certainly in Keep the Aspidistra Flying, Rosemary, who becomes pregnant, right? I mean, Gordon Comstock, the main character, he sees her as basically the tool of oppression that's going to keep him down and make him live a boring suburban life with an aspidistra in the window. An aspidistra is a sort of common house plant, and this is the ironic title, Keep the Aspidistra Flying, because he's been shackled to her by her becoming pregnant. Now he can't be a rebel, and he has to live in a 2-up, 2-down suburban house with an aspidistra in his window and a regular paycheck. And so she's doomed him, right? I mean, this is so there's, women do not come off well in Orwell's writing.
Does all of this disappoint you? I mean, the more you dug into this book and dwelt on everything you've just talked about, do you come away thinking, oh, I used to love Orwell, but now, oh no, there are lots of big problems here?
Well, maybe I share Orwell's power of facing unpleasant facts, right? So it gives me a more nuanced appreciation than I had when I first came to his writing. But I don't think that there's an argument, I mean, in the same way that I still read the Declaration of Independence, despite all the things I know about Thomas Jefferson, and think that it has a lot of value as a way of understanding what should be the ideals of this country, despite his own hypocrisies in writing it. I think that Orwell's writing, and particularly his political writing, has a lot to offer us. And the vision that he offers, both the warnings that he offers against, the ways that politics can go wrong, but also the more optimistic vision of the kind of better world that he hopes to see that emerges at some places in his writing, really has a lot of enduring value, despite the fact that his gender politics kind of give me a serious ick factor. So I wouldn't advocate throwing out the baby with the bathwater. I definitely still read Orwell and reread Orwell, and continue to find value in what he has to say.
And I wonder also on the point of racial politics as well. Orwell's views on the British Empire, for example, there seems some complexity on the one hand. You can see the injustice of the British in India, but on the other, he expresses reservations about, well, if Britain pulled out, the whole thing would collapse. I wonder if you could talk about his views there.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of empire, Orwell really, he tries to do the right thing. And I think he's broadly on the right side politically. And here, I guess, for those of you who don't have as much kind of Orwell biographical background, I might sort of sketch in his biography a little bit. So as I mentioned, he's born in 1903. He's born in India, in Matahari, but he moves back before he's 1 year old to live in England. And then he doesn't return to the British Raj again until he finishes school. His father comes back once during his childhood to visit, at which point his mother becomes pregnant again, and later his younger sister is born. So he has two sisters and his mother, and they live in England, and his father's away in India. until his retirement. And that's where their money comes from. It comes from the empire. He sees himself, and his writing is full of like a serious pity party about how he's financially less well off than many of the people he goes to school with, who have, vacation homes in Scotland and whose fathers drive Rolls Royces and who are living at large. But I mean, socioeconomically, he's in like the top 2%, right? I mean, he's the equivalent of someone who lives in Chevy Chase or Bethesda. And so his self-pity is a bit hard to take at times. But, and that economic security comes from the empire. And even before his father's career in the Indian civil service, his family is an imperial family of longstanding. Their original sort of social cachet and money came from slavery in the Caribbean. When slavery was abolished in Britain, the British government made massive payouts as retribution, compensation to slaveholders for having to give up their slaves, and that money helped to fund a marriage into the minor aristocracy for his great-great-grandfather, and a lot of their class standing came from empire. And so Orwell himself, when he leaves Eton, instead of going on to university, he volunteers to serve in the Indian police force. And he gets to choose where he wants to serve, and he chooses Burma, which is where his mother's family, which was also an imperial family, had lived. His mother had been born and grown up in Burma, and he'd never been. And so he goes to serve in Burma. Paul Theroux has actually written a great novel called Burma Sahib that came out a couple months ago, kind of imagining Orwell's time in Burma. But it's that experience of serving in the empire that actually informs what becomes his very strident anti-imperial politics. Because all of a sudden, at age 18, he's given a gun and a little bit of language tuition, and then he's given almost absolute and arbitrary power over tens of thousands of Burmese in the various communities where he's serving. And exercising that level of absolute and arbitrary power comes to really, disillusion him, to make him really, to create a real averse idea to empire as something that is despotic, tyrannical, arbitrary, also where there's a high degree of censorship for everyone involved, that if you are Burmese, you really can't speak your mind because you risk being thrown in prison. But if you're amongst the white governing classes and you have reservations about empire, you can't speak your mind either, because you have to behave like a Pukka Sahib, like a sort of respectable white man in Burma. And so all of these ideas about kind of tyranny and censorship and despotism that are then refined in his later writing, it's been argued that their origins really come out of his time in empire. I think they come more from his interaction with Stalinist politics in the Spanish Civil War, but I think there are elements of that critique of empire that he develops in Burma. And his first novel is actually, as most first novels are, it's got a very semi-autobiographical core, but it's about a young white guy who goes out to Burma and comes to hate the empire, right? And it was actually one of his friends, Cyril Connolly, who he'd gone to school with and then lost touch with, reviewed it not knowing that Eric Blair, his old school friend, had written it, because he published it under the pen name George Orwell. And he says, this is, it's a really good book, but it's, it's really stinging in its indictment of empire. It's a really harsh critique. But he does, at the same time that he thinks that empire is bad, Burmese Days is also a book that is full of kind of casual racism and alarming kind of, prejudices and, it's, and much of his other writing in his essays also is, it's very derogatory and casually racist towards the Burmese population that he's principally writing about, because that's what he knows. And so he thinks the empire is bad, but principally he thinks the empire is bad because it corrupts the white men who do the governing. More than, that's the lens he's looking at the evils of empire through, more than the way that it's impacting the people who are being arbitrarily governed. And so when it comes to this question, as you say, David, about, getting out of empire, he says, well, Britain should quit the empire. The empire is bad. Even if Britain becomes a poorer country because they no longer have their empire, we have to accept that reality might happen, but we should cut our losses. But then he kind of wavers back and forth about what Britain owes to the places that it formerly governed. And I think those are conversations that are still taking place now, right? I mean, we have them in the US in terms of reparations and the legacies of slavery, but they're also taking place in Britain in terms of, what Britain owes to the non-white communities in the country who are almost all immigrants from former parts of the empire and whose standard of living tends to be much lower. And also what Britain owes to its former colonies, particularly some Caribbean and African nations where years of enforced underdevelopment and monoagriculture, and in the Caribbean case, the legacies of slavery have really kind of left a permanent scar on those economies. And Orwell, in his own way, was grappling with that when he thought, should Britain just get out of India? Because on one level, he thinks if we do, then we've created this huge mess and we've walked away from it. But on the other level, he thinks we've done so much terrible to these people, we should just leave them alone and stop meddling with their country and let them get on with it. So it's conflicted, but I think when it comes to imperial politics, and particularly within the context of his time, his heart is in the right place, at least.
Before we go to the audience, will you indulge me one last what would Orwell think question?
I will do my best.
Which is, what if he had lived much longer, because he did die much too soon, and he'd observed the ongoing rise of America? Would he have seen that as a new empire? And I can imagine him perhaps traveling the US and writing about the tremendous inequality, the poverty. What would he have made of America in the 20th century?
Yeah, he could be our modern day Tocqueville, I guess you can imagine. I think you already saw by the time he died in 1950 a difference in the way that he was understood in Britain and the way that he was understood in the United States. And I think because his left-wing politics were much better known in Britain, all of the obituaries really emphasized the fact that he was someone who was a real advocate for social justice and whose politics are informed by a commitment to social justice. And they see 1984 for what I think it is, which is, on one level, a critique of totalitarianisms, and I think both a critique of Nazi totalitarianism and Stalinist totalitarianism, but also kind of a warning about the ways that the post-war Labour government under Clement Attlee, which he supported, had become increasingly centralized and bureaucratized, and how systems of kind of bureaucratic centralization tend to take on a logic of their own, and that there's a kind of will towards despotism that we have to guard against in democratic societies so that you don't have this kind of accretion of power at the center, right? And crucially, he's writing partially about, the Attlee government and what he's witnessing, but he's also writing about Truman's America in the context of a country that's recently dropped the atom bomb. He's actually known as, in an essay entitled Us and the Atom Bomb, being the first person to use the term Cold War in the 1940s. And crucially, Big Brother's regime is INGSOC, which is short for English socialism, and it governs Oceania, which is effectively North America and Britain. And Airstrip 1 is London, right, which has become, just by being called Airstrip 1 and taken from its name, it's become a kind of puppet component part of a larger empire that's clearly dominated by the United States. You get the sense through the novel, right? And so I think once he passes away, almost immediately the U.S. kind of turns to him, and all the focus is on Animal Farm in 1984, and he's presented as an early Cold Warrior, a critic of Stalin, that 1984, that Big Brother is basically, the Stalin figure, that alongside Animal Farm, which really is an allegory for Stalin. I mean, it is effectively a pretty direct allegory for Stalin. That these two works are vehicles for critiquing specifically Soviet totalitarianism, and therefore Orwell is of the right and is a Cold Warrior, and later Peter Hitchens effectively argues would be a neocon alongside him, right? In a book he writes, Why Orwell Matters, which could have been but I think the weight of evidence, doesn't bear that out. And so he's already been misappropriated, right, by the United States even before he dies. And one of the last letters that he writes, which is then published in the New York Times Book Review during his lifetime, is to a member of the UAW, who I think is also a wobbly, and is about 1984 specifically. And he says, 1984 is not a critique of socialism, that I voted for and I support the labor government. It is, merely, or not merely, but it is, it's a example taken to a product extreme of the way that regimes, if not vigilant, can be corrupted. But it is not a critique of socialism, and he's very explicit about that. But the fact that he has to write this letter, and the fact that he has to say, this is not an anti-socialist book to an American audience, and then the New York Times Book Review is, publishing this, I think underscores the extent to which, from the moment the book was published in the U.S., it was taken as a anti-socialist critique, and I think that's persisted. But that was not what he meant it to be. And so even before he passes away, and even though he himself has never been to the United States, there's this kind of tension between him and America in terms of how America is reading him versus how he wants his work to be read.
Madam, first question.
That was terrific. Really wonderful. I read 1984 in high school in the early 1960s. And right in the middle of the Cold War. And nobody talked about the Cold War in connection. I mean, we talked about the Cold War all the time. The Cuban Missile Crisis happened when I was in high school. But Orwell had nothing to do with it. But I think about Orwell all the time. Two things. One, Big Brother, constant surveillance. That's what we've got now. Big Brother is watching you. Google is checking everything you put in your computer. There are cameras all over. There is Xinjiang, which I think is spreading all over China. There are cameras. They say there are cameras everywhere. They have stuff. They put stuff on your phone so they can check you, and we could end up that way too. Not because the government is doing it, but because the tech people are doing it. So what do you think of that, and how scary that was? I mean, the thing about Big Brother is they knew everything about them.
Yeah.
And the second thing is disinformation. So you're talking about free speech. What I remember is war is peace, freedom is slavery. I forget the third one.
What is it?
Ignorance, maybe?
Ignorance is strength.
Ignorance is strength. There you go. That was that's disinformation of the most deliberate, primitive. I mean, and that seems to be where we're going. Everything is upside down.
Yeah, I mean, it's sadly, it's true. And at the end of the book, I sort of, I talk a bit about what Orwell got right versus what he didn't really foresee, and the value of continuing to read him, but with an eye to our current moment. And really, you're right that the surveillance for those of us in the West, right, is largely done by Meta, by Twitter, by Google. We'll probably be giving you guys all, search recommendations and advertisements to do with Orwell for the next several days. We're being constantly surveilled, by private corporations, which was not something he foresaw, right? I mean, and I think that's because 1984 is really written at this moment of state power having reached its apogee, right? You have a victorious Soviet Russia, but you also have a now newly defeated Nazi Germany, but one that he actually attributed Nazi Germany's early success a lot to the degree of government centralization and the way it prosecuted. I mean, fairly enough. But also he's watching the Attlee government, which is just, nationalized a lot of things, created a Bureau of Economic Planning, really strengthened the state. And so for him, the state is the vehicle you have to worry about. And I think he just didn't foresee the degree to which private, private companies could be a threat. Though it's worth pointing out that if you live in Xi's China, if you live in North Korea, if you live in Putin's Russia, right, the state is the one doing the surveilling, and the state is the one doing the enforcing of punishment for deviance.
Putting cadres in people's homes. I guess that's just in Xinjiang for now.
Well, if you think about Xinjiang too, I mean, the idea that the Uyghurs have to be re-educated, that they can't, it's not enough to just imprison them or to make their lives miserable, but they have to be forcibly re-educated to be proper Chinese, I think reflects the way that Orwell really emphasizes that totalitarianism is not just about controlling people's bodies, but about controlling people's minds.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Scary.
And so, I mean, he's both, there are things he missed, but there are also things I think he was quite prescient on that are definitely still with us.
Frightening. And I mean, I read it 60 years ago. Well, thank you. And I'm looking forward to reading the book.
Thanks.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for your fascinating presentation. I'm curious as to what you think was Orwell's greatest motivation or motivations to write about the topics that he did. I mean, for example, authoritarianism, fascism, inequality. What do you think was really the number one driver, or the number one and number two drivers behind his passion for writing about the issues he did?
I think that one of the things that's difficult about Orwell's legacy is that he would have said himself, and I think he meant, that everything he wrote from the mid-1930s was written with an eye against, anti-fascism and a kind of anti-totalitarian politics, and really, meaning a totalitarian politics of the right. And I think that, 1984 is very much a critique of that kind of fascist authoritarianism as well. But because he saw himself as someone who was committed to telling the truth even when the truth was ugly, he spent almost as much, if not more time, critiquing the totalitarianism of the left, despite seeing himself as a leftist. And this really emerges, I think, from the homage to his experience in Spain, which he writes about in Homage to Catalonia, which I think is a kind of pivotal moment for his political education. Because when he goes to Spain, he sees himself as an anti-fascist. He volunteers just through connections, through friends, to fight for the POUM, which is an international Marxist party. And he sees everyone who's fighting Franco as basically much of a muchness, right? They're all fighting Franco. They're all trying to defend democracy against tyranny and authoritarianism. But he soon learns that actually there are lots of different factions within the Republican coalition. And the main socialist government faction is increasingly being funded by the Soviet Union and falling consequently under the sway of the Soviet Union. And that main faction turns on the POUM, him and his colleagues who've been risking their lives. Orwell shot in the throat while serving in Spain. He just misses, like Donald Trump, he just misses a much more serious outcome, right? But the socialist government turns on the POUM and they arrest several of his colleagues. A few of them are ultimately executed. And they start defaming them and saying that they're actually saboteurs, that they're trying to undermine the revolution. I mean, you see this played out in 1984, or in Animal Farm and Allegorical. They're branded as snowballs. And he comes home and he says people need to know about this as much as they need to know about why to fight for Spain. And he tries to get his publisher to publish Homage to Catalonia. And his publisher, in which he tells the story of what's happened to the POUM, says, I'm not going to publish this because it's going to undermine the left coalition, and it's the most important thing is the fight against fascism and supporting the Republican government against Franco's Spain. And so he has to find another publisher, and he ends up bringing it out with a small press. But even when he publishes Homage to Catalonia, he still says at the end, even after all of this, I still support the Republic against Franco. But the thing is, for most readers of the book, what comes through is the critique of Stalinism, which is very clear-eyed and very ardent, and less the critique of fascism. But I think he would have seen the main driving force of his politics as an anti-fascist conviction. You're welcome. Hey.
Hi. So you mentioned Anna Funder's book earlier in your talk. And there's a line in her book where she mentions that Orwell is able to treat women so poorly, so inequitably, because he holds the idea of patriarchy as the doublethink that allows him to do that. So I was just wondering if you agree with her description as patriarchy as the ultimate doublethink, or is his misogyny just kind of chauvinism, kind of just garden variety hypocrisy?
Well, I think this gets back to David's question, right, about whether there is a self-consciousness in the way that he writes about women and marginalizes women and the violence towards women in 1984, and whether there's some self-recognition. And I guess the thing about doublethink is that you don't have the self-recognition, that you manage to unthink your knowledge of your own hypocrisy in holding two mutually opposing convictions at once. And it would be nice to think that Orwell was that self-aware. I mean, there are other aspects of his life in which he is quite self-aware. His anti-Semitism becomes something that he actually takes account of during the Second World War. He's casually anti-Semitic, growing up, and really does try to course correct on. But we don't see, I mean, feminist scholars have read 1984 against the grain, right, and have tried to find ways in which Julia is actually a more sophisticated and empowered individual. And actually, a woman named Sandra Newman just wrote a novel called Julia, in which she kind of reimagines 1984 from the perspective of Julia, and gives her agency and gives her power that Orwell had denied her. But I don't know. I mean, I think there's an element of special pleading to make that argument. I mean, the evidence, India, just is not there to sustain it. I'd like to believe it, but so much of the bulk of his writing is kind of casually just, there's just a casual assumption that comes out in so many places of a gendered order in which women are less than, that it's really hard to believe that he's anything other than holding his doublethink, unself-awarely.
Thank you.
No problem.
Hi, thank you. In the context of Big Brother looking through these companies at communications and so forth, do you have any thoughts on how this would fit into the whole discussion? The idea of a government body monitoring all the communications of the employees.
Well, I think when Biden set up and then ultimately had to scrape because of the pushback, his disinformation board, I guess probably a couple of years ago now, right? The right immediately kind of said, this is doublethink. This is Orwellian thought policing. And, this is somehow beyond the pale. And, Biden was saying, well, my intent is to actually ensure that we don't have this kind of disinformation getting out. And that was more about, I guess, surveilling the broader media than surveilling employees. But it does bring up, which I think is one of the real tensions that Orwell grapples with throughout his own career, right? I mean, because he is an advocate for free speech, but he is also an advocate for truth. And how do you ensure free speech without a good, or how do you ensure true speech without a good amount of surveillance and thought policing, right? And I think, I talk a lot about this in the book, but I think that is one of the contradictions that he's grappling with throughout his career, is the fact that actually to ensure truth, you do have to sort of surveil false speech, but free speech is in itself, something to be valued. And I mean, government surveilling your communications, or private companies, surveilling their employees' communications, is not always to ensure their true speech. Sometimes it's to ensure their loyalty,
Right.
I mean, oftentimes. So I think that's something he would be inherently uncomfortable with. And I think there's, no ambiguity on that front. But this question about the degree to which, you actually need someone to do the policing in order to ensure that truth is what prevails, I think is a trickier issue, and one that he was less fully comfortable with in his own thinking.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks. With like George Orwell, what you mentioned, like the rise of like authoritarianism, like as he's living in the age like the 1930s, you see Germany becoming fascist, Italy becoming fascist, and you see like even in his own country there are like Oswald Mosley and his fascist party on the rise. But is his authoritarianism besides directed to fascism also directed towards what could be dubbed as red fascism, like Stalin's, because the 30s he's basically purging anyone who is the ones that did help him get into power, and like his infamous show trials in the 30s. Is he also warning of what could happen even if right or left gets into power, that eventually authoritarianism takes over, right?
So before he goes to Spain, he does the research for and writes the draft manuscript of The Road to Wigan Pier, which is published then in 1937 while he's in Spain. And the second half of The Road to Wigan Pier, in which he's kind of expounding his own political philosophy, is very clearly anti-Stalinist as well as anti-fascist. And he has a real critique of the ways in which much of the British left at this time he sees as kind of beholden to the Soviet Union. And this is before he has, other than reading in newspapers, and there was, I mean, you could read about the show trials. I mean, the New York Times has a great bit in the reporting on one of the show trials in the 1930s saying, this is as if, John Adams had rounded up, John Jay and, Hamilton and, all these other people and then executed them for treason, all the other founding fathers. I mean, there's a sense that this is clearly insane. It's not like people later realized how insane it was. I mean, people, and he read the newspapers. He knew what was going on. He was not a fan of the Soviet Union, but his own much more clearly articulated and thought through anti-Soviet writing, especially Animal Farm, comes from that experience, I think, in Spain in 1937, in which the men he's fighting alongside, men and women, though he doesn't talk very much about the women, that he's fighting alongside find themselves, persecuted by a Stalinist-funded regime. And I think that brings home for him in a way he hadn't previously realized that the threat from Stalinism is as serious as the threat from Nazi totalitarianism.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for coming. Well, congratulations on the book. Are we doing signed copies? Yeah.
Yeah, so